Imagine this: two friends, dressed casually, stroll into a quiet neighborhood diner, chatting and minding their own business. But as they sit down, the mood shifts. A local cop enters, his eyes scanning the room before locking onto them. His demeanor changes, suspicion flares up, and things quickly escalate. He demands IDs, questions their intentions, and accuses them of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The tension is thick, and the bystanders are frozen, unsure whether to intervene. Just when it seems the situation can't get worse, the officer learns something about these two men that leaves him utterly speechless. What could possibly make him rethink everything? Stick around as we unravel this gripping story of bias, justice, and an unforgettable lesson that left an entire community shaken. You won't want to miss how this confrontation takes a turn no one saw coming. The officer's tone was sharp as he continued questioning the two men. His gaze never softened, and his words carried an air of judgment. "What are you doing here?" he asked, ignoring their calm explanations about just wanting a quiet meal. The two friends exchanged uneasy glances, their patience wearing thin, but knowing they had to stay composed. The other customers whispered among themselves, some watching nervously, others pretending not to notice. The diner staff looked uncomfortable, unsure how to handle the unfolding drama. What the officer didn't know was that these two men weren't just anyone. They had lived lives full of purpose and had stories that could command respect in any room, if only he cared to listen. Instead, he dug in deeper, demanding to search their belongings. The friends stayed silent for a moment, letting the weight of the situation sink in. What would happen next? One of the men, Marcus, calmly asked, "Officer, is there a reason we're being treated like criminals?" His voice was steady, but you could sense the frustration beneath it. The officer ignored his question, insisting they provide proof of why they were in the area. The other man, James, shook his head and pulled out his phone, saying, "We don't need to explain ourselves. This is getting ridiculous." The officer's eyes narrowed, his hand inching toward his belt, as though preparing for trouble that wasn't there. Meanwhile, a young waitress at the counter fidgeted nervously, glancing between the officer and the men. She wanted to say something but didn't know how. The room felt suffocating, filled with unspoken tension. As Marcus opened his mouth to respond, the officer suddenly noticed a logo on James's jacket, a familiar emblem he couldn't quite place. His expression shifted slightly, but the doubt and suspicion lingered. What had he just realized? The officer stared at the logo, his mind racing to connect the dots. His demeanor didn't soften entirely, but there was a flicker of hesitation. "Where'd you get that jacket?" he demanded, his voice tinged with suspicion. James raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "It's mine." "Why?" he replied coolly. Marcus glanced at James, a silent understanding passing between them. They knew what the officer was starting to piece together, but they weren't about to make it easy for him. At that moment, the waitress, unable to stay silent any longer, cautiously stepped forward. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. The officer waved her off without a second glance. "Stay out of this," he barked, his eyes still locked on the two men. The diner was dead silent except for the faint sound of the coffee machine in the background. Then, a sharp buzz broke through. The officer's radio crackled with an incoming message. He hesitated before responding, his attention torn between his duties and the mounting realization of who these men might be. The tension in the room was unbearable, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. The officer finally answered his radio, but his eyes never left Marcus and James. "Yeah, I've got a situation here," he said, his tone guarded. As the voice on the other end gave him details, his expression shifted again, this time to something resembling panic. He glanced back at the emblem on James's jacket and then at Marcus, as if seeing them for the first time. The tension in the room spiked. What had he just learned? James leaned forward slightly, breaking the silence. "You figured it out yet?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with defiance. Marcus crossed his arms, watching the officer squirm. The other diners exchanged puzzled looks, and the waitress stayed rooted to the spot, her hands gripping a tray so tightly her knuckles turned white. The officer's hand, still near his belt, froze as the radio crackled again. This time, the voice on the other end was clearer, and it mentioned a name. A name that sent a visible jolt through the officer. Suddenly, the cop looked less sure of himself. Marcus and James weren't just two ordinary men, and whatever the officer had just learned seemed to turn the situation on its head. But what exactly was it? And why did it leave him speechless? The room held its collective breath, waiting for the next move. The officer's radio blared again, this time repeating the name with more urgency. His face went pale as realization set in. "You'll," he stammered, pointing at James but unable to finish the sentence. Marcus sighed, leaning back in his chair. "We've been trying to stay low-key, but I guess that's not happening today," he said, shaking his head. James stood up slowly, his presence commanding the room. "That's right," he said, pulling out a badge from his pocket. "Special Agent James Carter, FBI." Gasps rippled through the diner as everyone froze in disbelief. The officer's jaw dropped, and he took an involuntary step back. "And him," James continued, motioning to Marcus, "is a decorated U.S. Army captain. Now, do you want to explain why we've been treated like suspects?" The officer stuttered an apology, but James wasn't finished. "Here's the twist," he added, his voice sharp. "We're here investigating reports of corruption within law enforcement, and guess whose name keeps coming up?" The officer's face turned red as the room erupted in whispers. The tables had turned completely, and now all eyes were on him. Marcus stood, placing a hand on James's shoulder. "Let's let Internal Affairs handle this," he said calmly. As they walked out, the officer's radio buzzed one last time, a voice asking for a status update. He had no words. The diner was left in stunned silence, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. As Marcus and James walked out of the diner, the atmosphere inside remained heavy with disbelief. The officer stood frozen, still processing what had just unfolded. The other customers began murmuring, their earlier silence replaced by shock and quiet outrage. The young waitress, who had watched the entire encounter, felt a sense of relief and pride that justice had prevailed in such an unexpected way. Outside, James and Marcus exchanged a glance, their calm composure hiding the frustration they had felt throughout the ordeal. "Another day, another lesson," Marcus said with a wry smile. James nodded. "People show their true colors when they think no one's watching. At least now, some of them might think twice." As they got into their car and drove off, the message was clear. Assumptions based on appearances can lead to consequences far beyond what anyone expects. Sometimes, the tables turn faster than anyone sees coming.